Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth George, Director of Member Engagement and Chapter Development with the American Guild of Organists. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Know Your Value. We have a wonderful group of subject knowledge experts who are going to take us through this step by step. And they include Vincent Carr, Counselor for Education, Vicki Schaefer, Counselor for Membership, Leslie Wolf-Robb, Counselor for Communications, and from our national office, Executive Director James E. Thomashour and Executive Assistant Eric Burke. Before I turn the floor over to Vincent, just a couple of housekeeping notes. This is being recorded and the recording will be uploaded probably within the next 48 hours onto our website. As well, you are muted, but we do want to hear from you. So we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box. I will be monitoring these throughout the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, I will be fielding questions to our panelists so that your questions can be answered. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Vincent Carr.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Prior to becoming Counselor of Education, I directed the Committee on Career Development and Support last year. The main thrust of their work was publishing this wonderful new resource entitled Employing Musicians in Religious Institutions. I will say more about this handbook in a moment, but I think it's very important for us to situate the unveiling of this resource in a factual discussion about the AGO and how the AGO has historically dealt with some employment issues. In that light, I'm going to turn the mic over to Eric Burke, Executive Assistant, who will speak about salary guidelines.
Thank you, Vince. Before I talk about the salary guidelines, I just want to show everybody where they can download this new resource. If you go to our website's homepage, you'll see this slider image, and clicking on that will take you to a post page. And on that post page, you'll see, if you scroll down, an image of the cover of this new book. And when you click on that, you'll be able to view on your browser or download it to your computer. So the history of our salary guidelines began probably a lot later than we might think. AGO once provided salary tables that we are no longer able to circulate. You may be surprised to learn that the development of salary tables did not occur in our 125-year history until the 1980s, when the Work and Compensation Guide was released. And now I'm going to show you a slide of some materials that we used to publish. A 2-volume resource was made available in 1986 and updated as 1 volume in 1990, which encouraged chapters to survey their members to anonymously determine what the range of actual salaries in their local areas were, in order to develop local tables of recommended salary ranges based on education, skills, and experience. In the fall of 1997, a national salary guide was developed, then posted regularly on the AGO website. The figures were based on full-time salary levels across the USA, teacher salaries, that is. Once we had the guide and were using it for several years, we felt as though we always had them, or that we should have had them, and relied on them as a reference point in determining or requesting salary adjustments. These guidelines were available to AGO members and the general public until November of 2016, when they were taken down pursuant to the investigation by the Federal Trade Commission, which later resulted in the settlement agreement in which AGO agreed to no longer post salary tables. During its short life of just under 20 years, the National AGO Salary Guidelines helped many with numbers on a scale that they could point to as a standard, but for others it presented an unforeseen challenge. Many of the figures at the lower end of the guidelines were too low for most of our members living in expensive areas, and employers in rural areas with lower cost of living often found even the lowest recommended levels too high. For those with more credentials, greater experience, and demanding full-time positions at the upper end of the chart, the recommended levels could be too low if they were living in areas with a higher cost of living. Those of us negotiating with employers often continue to use salary guidelines developed and maintained by local chapters, which could maintain charts more in line with local living costs, but even then some found the upper end lower than what they currently earned. When I began working at AGO headquarters in 2012, the Committee on Career Development and Support and AGO's National Council were presented with a quandary. Should the amounts on the chart be raised by the rate of inflation, thus risking those employers refusing to continue to use the chart if they're in areas with lower cost of living or for whom the figure seemed unaffordable? Or should it remain the same, causing musicians that already earn more than the highest recommended levels in places with a high cost of living to not use the chart at all in conversations about compensation? Until the last year of its most recently updated levels, the AGO revised the amounts only once since the year 2012. Many of our members thought it was a helpful resource, but even with added recommendations to check the cost of living comparison equations, it clearly did not help everyone like we would have liked it to. In the worst case scenario, my floor could be the employer's ceiling in salary negotiation. Casual conversation with colleagues within and outside of the AGO membership revealed a wide range of what was taken into consideration when an employer made a salary offer or an organist made a salary request, either in situations where a current relationship was being renegotiated or when a candidate was seeking to be hired. After the first National Salary Guidelines chart was published, the Committee on Professional Concerns found they had to frequently refer to the formula for determining workload provided in the Chapter Management Handbook to help members calculate the hours per week they were working. That formula later became our time requirements worksheet, updated in 2017 to comply with the FTC settlement agreement. What our new Employing Musicians Handbook provides are commentary on topics that should be included in the conversations between employers and candidates or current employees regarding a range of issues, including compensation. And now for some further perspective on salary tables and other issues related to material in this new handbook, I'm turning you over to our Executive Director, James Thomas-Schauer.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm really going to focus in my remarks on the topic, the AGO is not a union. The AGO is an educational organization formed under Section 501c3 of the IRS Code. Unions are formed under Section 501c5. We have to follow rules and regulations governing C3s, not C5s. We can't publish pay scales like unions do because the AGO is not a union. The FTC says that as a C3, we would be violating antitrust laws if we were to publish salary guidelines. The FTC simply won't allow us to do so. The AGO is not a union. We are not permitted to have a grievance process that might result in putting certain churches on a so-called blacklist and then restricting competition by telling all of our members that none of them are permitted to take a job at that church under pain of being disciplined by the Guild. Moreover, we should not be in the business of publishing lists of bad actors, as we then run the risk of being sued ourselves for libel or slander by the employing institution. And it sets us up as being in opposition to the religious community that we are trying to serve. The AGO is not a union, so we cannot restrict competition for jobs or have any policies that can even be perceived as restricting competition for a job, like the policy that we used to have in our Code of Ethics, declaring that no member can seek a job for himself or for a colleague or a student if someone already held that job. In theory, an incumbent musician could have filed a disciplinary proceeding against another Guild member who sought the incumbent's job, even if that other member was better qualified for the job and a better fit for it. The job seeker might then have been forced to leave the Guild if the disciplinary proceeding found in favor of the incumbent. The AGO is not a union, so we cannot have a model contract or model contract provisions because regulatory agencies like the FTC won't permit it. We can, however, provide very extensive documentation about what should be in an agreement between an organist and that person's employer, and we are currently in the process of creating that document. The AGO is not a union, so we don't get involved in collective bargaining or negotiating salary and benefits for our members. This doesn't mean we can't advocate for our members. With the publication of our new handbook, we can advocate vigorously for our members by providing resources like this new one that our members are encouraged to use to negotiate a better salary and better benefits. The AGO is not a union. If we were, we could not accept tax-deductible charitable donations. As a 501c3, we have the extraordinary right as a nonprofit entity to be able to accept tax-deductible charitable gifts. In fact, we have received some very substantial multi-million-dollar donations that we probably would never have received at all if we were a union, because unions can't receive tax-deductible gifts. For that matter, chapters would also not receive charitable donations if the Guild were a union, because to the donors, those gifts would not be tax-deductible. In fact, if we were to form ourselves as a union, it might very well agitate and irritate the people who make those donations to us in the first place. We've always been a professional guild working on the educational aspects and the career development of our membership, offering certification programs, competitions, conventions, POEs, etc. By comparison, unions require a degree of militancy. It's like having a metaphorical target on your back if you are a union steward or a union organizer. The question has been asked, why don't we just reinvent ourselves as a union? Or if we could start all over, would we have been better off forming as a union? No, says Edward Ted Walter emphatically, and he should know. The current dean of the Cincinnati chapter, Ted describes himself as a full-time music sub. He is also a licensed attorney in Ohio who has years of experience, not only as a management attorney, but also as a union organizer, a union steward, a union representative, and a national and local union negotiator. Ted, who told me that he would be attending this webinar, has described himself as a, quote, hot-headed union organizer, close quote. And he was personally involved in the formation of the union for the office of the chief counsel in the Department of the Treasury. I spent 45 minutes on the phone with Ted earlier today discussing the merits of the guild becoming a union. And he was quick to point out that we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot if we were to move toward unionization. It would be a counterproductive waste of our time and effort, he explained, especially given the Supreme Court's decision affirming the ministerial and ecclesiastical exception that Vince is going to talk about. If we were to unionize, said Ted, the guild would be establishing itself more as a militant force than a professional force. We would create ill will with churches and educational institutions that employ our members. It would set us back. We'd have to spend lots of time meeting with employment managers and other management personnel who do the hiring at these institutions and get involved with collective bargaining and court cases. Doing so would take our focus and our attention away from our mission as an educational institution fostering a thriving community of musicians who share their knowledge and inspire passion for the organ. In fact, it would tarnish the reputation of the guild, as we'd no longer be primarily a professional organization focusing on the art and the craft of organ music. We'd be something very different, and we'd be placing ourselves in a distinctly adversarial role with our employers. If we don't have the stomach and the will to be a union, we shouldn't go down that path, said Ted. Given that we have about 13,000 members, we might need 10,000 collective bargaining units to engage in collective bargaining negotiations with all the different individual churches and institutions that employ guild members. But churches would have no interest in collective bargaining. They just hire a different organist. And they could do so because of the ministerial exception. By becoming a union, we would stain our image as a professional guild. We'd be taking ourselves out of our mission of creating the best possible environment for excellence in music making. We'd be putting ourselves at odds with churches when we should be trying to work more closely with them. It's just not realistic to expect the AGO to have and to devote the resources to go to bat for every member in every employment situation. As Ted Walter said to me, he will have no part in tarring and feathering pastors. If an employer rejects your value, it is only harming itself. You have to walk away, this is a quote from Ted, you have to walk away from a job that doesn't pay you enough. AGO members have to create value for churches and work on professionalizing the services we provide. In Ted's words, the AGO offers, and I quote, a touch of class and, quote, a margin of excellence, very different than an unprofessional labor force that benefits from unionization. The AGO is not a union, and we should not treat our members as union laborers. We are better than that. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Vince Carr.
Thank you, James. I'm going to go ahead and share a portion of my screen so that you can see on your full screen what I'm looking at. As I mentioned, the Career Development and Support Committee last year worked tirelessly on this resource, and I want to acknowledge them now. Under the aegis of David Lamb, our former counselor for membership, and with the assistance of Eric Burke from the national office. The committee members under my direction were Jessica French, Anthony Rispo, Doris Dabrowski, and Andrew Johnson, who both pored over this document and offered feedback and proofreading and revisions to get to our final form that we have now. Nicole Cochran has joined the committee, and I'd like to acknowledge Vicki Schaefer, who's our current counselor for membership overseeing that committee. So let's dive into the document. As you can see, the document actually originated as a handbook from the Association of Church Musicians from the Madison, Wisconsin chapter. Once you go through the first few pages, you'll come across a contents page. And this is very helpful because you can just choose the section you want to go to. You click on it and it'll go immediately to that section. If you need to go back to the contents page, just click at the bottom on the footer and you're heading right back to the contents page. After that, you'll see a preface which describes a lot of the history and the background of this guide, as well as all the individuals who worked toward its completion. Kind of sprinkled all throughout the book are these little quotes that we hope bring some light on some of the more important facts. Here's a sample of one. A search committee should consider the breadth of work in the hands of a music minister. One of the first goals of this guidebook is to educate search committees about the breadth of responsibilities for an organist, choir director, or music director. It's important that the committee understands all that's involved so that they can accurately give the type of support and properly compensate the individual. We give a list of some typical responsibilities of a choir director, as well as typical responsibilities of the organist, while acknowledging that if those positions are combined, that's a considerable amount of work for the music director, and perhaps the church should consider other ways in which they can provide some support. If you're calculating the hours that you're spending in a church position, but are perhaps unsure of how to do that, we have a very helpful handbook here, a little worksheet toward the back that you can scroll through and add your hours up essentially so that you arrive at the proper figure at the end. Let's dive into the actual application itself. This was one of the more important areas of debate for us, and I want to stress something that James talked about, which is the ministerial exception. This exception, which was, as James said, reinforced by the Supreme Court last year, gives churches and religious institutions very broad and wide-ranging discretion when it comes to hiring practices and employment itself. So essentially, anti-discrimination kind of has no place here. For example, if a Catholic church says that they will not hire you because you are not Catholic, they are within their rights to do that. And there's really nothing we can do about that. Even if the AGO were to advocate, there's essentially no teeth in that, and it would not pass the muster of the law. So this was considered very seriously when we drew up these application procedures. We tried to instill some of the best practices we could. As you can see here, we delineate each part of the process prior to the interview, during the interview, as well as after the interview. So giving some best practices as you go throughout these. I'd like to point out one thing, which is there has been a decline in formal contracts. So these are somewhat rare nowadays. However, a simple letter of agreement can go a very long way in having both sides have something in writing with regard to the position. Now for the big can of worms, compensation. So we approach this very holistically, and it's very important that you as a reader, you as a candidate, and also that those on committees look at it holistically. It is not just salary. If you are consumed by your salary figure, you are most likely not considering your compensation because there are so many dimensions to this. So many factors determine an equitable compensation, and it's important that you recognize them in your negotiations and when you're going through your interview process. There are lists here that are helpful reminders of those various components. So it's important when you're going into a negotiation, as we say with the title of this webinar, that you do know your value and you know what that represents. We even provide a sample here of an annual employment review for those of you who are accustomed to having employment reviews with your employer each year. There's a good guide there with some questions. It'll take you again to the end of the document where there's an appendix. We also talk a little bit about how the AGO certifications can reflect that, not in that it's guaranteeing a certain amount of pay, but that it bolsters this holistic package that the committee is looking at. It's also important to note that some churches and religious institutions might look at the musician's salary as an all-inclusive resort, where they're able to just pay the salary and everything gets taken care of. But here we remind that there are music program expenses that go along with that salary. As we go further into the document, we deal with some of the ancillary events that affect a music director. For example, weddings and funerals, which can often be a hot button issue, and they can often be folded into packages for organists and choir masters. It's important that you understand some of the best practices here. For example, you really should have the couple or family pay the church prior to the event, and then the church pays you, which can prevent some of that really uncomfortable hunting everyone down and trying to find family members to pay you. After this, we also talk a little bit about substitute organists. As you remember, things like bench fees and how we can navigate that in a very collegial fashion. We also talk about the certification program as an extension of education, and how the obsession sometimes with academic degrees does not necessarily add up. So in other words, credentialization doesn't always equal qualification, and that committee should consider the breadth of experience, perhaps how many years an individual has dedicated to a certain denomination or to a certain profession, and what weight that carries in their overall decision. Lastly, toward the end, we provide a copy of the Code of Ethics as well as the Code of Professional Standards. And I mentioned previously the two appendices at the end, which talk about hours of employment, your kind of weekly hours, as well as an annual employment review sample contract. Okay, I'd like to turn it over to Vicki Schaefer now, our new counselor for membership.
Great, thank you, Vince. And congratulations to the committee. I want to publicly thank them because, as you can see, a lot of work went into this. And some of you might be sitting there thinking there's so much here, I don't even know where to begin to know where to start looking. And I want to assure you that the committee is going to continue to do their mission, which is to improve and sustain the professional working conditions for all of us. And if you're on this webinar, you probably have had an issue maybe in a church or in some kind of employment, and that's what we're here for. So some things that the committee will be doing in the future will be some articles. And I think if you look at just look at the table of contents, we will be taking every little section apart and kind of giving you some guidelines on how you can look at this. The other thing is a resource that you can always use is the hotline, which is available through the website, either by phone call or email. You can send us questions. We are here for you. We're all in this together. The other thing that you can do, and we will be happy to help you with this, you can take this webinar recording that will be available, as Elizabeth said, in the next 48 hours or so, and use that as a meeting, a virtual meeting, so you can sit there and talk about it together. I've done a couple meetings over the years with some different chapters where it's turned into just a session of asking questions and saying, this is what has happened to me. How can I solve this? Because I think sometimes with situations like this, the main problem is sometimes we feel like we're all alone, that we're the only person who's ever had this sort of problem. So we are here to help. I know that Anthony Rispo has already lined up a chapter where he's going to be going and doing a meeting and kind of helping to facilitate conversations. So please reach out to us. Our email addresses and phone numbers are all on the website. We will be happy to help you in whatever way we can to just start conversations so we know that you're not alone. So with that, I will turn this over to Leslie Wolf-Robb, who is our secretary and counselor for communications.
Thank you, Vicki. It's our hope that this new Employing Musicians Guide will provide clarity for both our members and the religious institutions which employ them. As Eric Burke mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar, you can read and download this document from the AGO website, and it will be available for you to order a print version for yourself as well. You're encouraged to read it thoroughly yourself and to share it with your congregational and denominational leaders. If you have questions or concerns, please feel free to contact the Committee on Career Development and Support. Contact information for them is available on the AGO website under the Careers tab. Now I'd like to turn this back over to Elizabeth George, our Director of Member Engagement and Chapter Development, who will coordinate our question and answer time. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, we do have some good conversations going on. And Jennifer Cho has a comment and a question, and I think this book is going to help her. As every church moves to live streaming, some churches like mine choose to continue streaming indefinitely for post-pandemic. Should a church musician be paid extra after the pandemic for being streamed online every week as routine? Who would like to answer that? And do we really have a definitive answer? James, I knew your hand would be up. If you want to, okay, you need to unmute yourself.
Right. Only because I actually had a conversation with, I think it was an attorney, quite frankly, recently on that very topic. Do I feel at all competent to provide a reply? And the answer is that the work you do for the church is actually owned by the church, not by you. You're hired by the church. You're doing work for the church. The church has a right to continue to stream the music that you've provided at a later time if it wants. That's not something you can control. And that's how it works. It's the church's right to do that.
Thank you, James. Eileen Gunther, love your comment. The AGO is not a union and it has never seen itself as such. The proactive work that James describes was done in good faith. The guidelines, grievance procedures, and model contracts were done out of a desire to achieve greater professional recognition by churches. It was only in the course of time and with the guidance of the government. And I know, James, you were typing an answer to her, but Eileen, thank you for your comment. Okay, from Christine Hogan, would you please, oh, sorry, you want to go on?
Well, just before we go on,
Yep.
I did type a comment in one place and was even texting with Eileen about this. So we had a lot of wonderful different resources like the grievance procedures and our old code of ethics in place, and they were of their time. And we were proud of them, like the salary guidelines, very proud of them because they provided good resources to our members. But times change, and the FTC suddenly decided to kind of pay attention to what we're doing and took a really hard look at everything that we're doing in the 2020, in the 21st century, in the early part of the 21st century, and just decided that we couldn't do certain things in the current climate under the more strict rules and regulations. I see Cindy Lindeen Martin's comment as well regarding salary guidelines. I'd like to address that also, if I might, regarding salary guidelines. How is it that ALM and ALCM, for instance, can publish salary guidelines, but the AGO cannot? How is that different? I don't know that it is different. If the FTC takes a good hard look at what they're doing, let's hope they don't, they might have the same issues that the FTC has brought up to us. So while they're there, I'm not going to make any representations about the legality of their being able, of those organizations being able to do so. So, you know, one at a time. MTNA, we talked about this a lot. The MTNA had difficulties with the FTC, and they had to change what they did. It wasn't salary guidelines, it was different. But as the FTC looks at different organizations, they find different things. So I can't comment on that, but I just know what the FTC has said that we cannot do, and we have to follow those rules. Thank you,
James. From Christine Hogan, would you, Vince has got his hand up. Would you please expand on what you mean by program music expenses?
Thank you for your question, Christine. I've gone ahead and excerpted the page from here. I think the issue of contention is that sometimes when employers are hiring organists or choir directors, they sometimes forget about the other expenses that go along with that are not related to salary. And so here we've outlined those expenses, that sometimes the purchase of music needs to be provided for, or mailing expenses, or books, recordings, music periodicals. So this is something where if you're in a negotiation and it hasn't been mentioned, you might want to check on those. Is there a budget for these things? They might not know actually that there needs to be a budget for these things. For example, if the choral library is very scarce. So that's what's usually meant by music program expenses. It's the operational side of the music program.
Thank you. Question from someone, were any of the denominational organizational documents reviewed as this was drafted? Vince?
So I will say that as this was being created, we had representatives from various denominations giving feedback, but also, most importantly, we had legal advice at each step of this process. So sometimes things were supposed to go in the document and they were not to appear in the document after we sought legal advice. So we were carefully trying to consider all of these ramifications and previous documents. But as James said, it's important not to create these comparisons between different denominational organizations because it really is pertaining to the FTC's oversight.
Oh, here's another good question. Can you talk about health insurance? What if a church cannot afford to offer health insurance? Should we suggest partial compensation? Vince, James, Leslie, Vicki? Okay, Eric, very good, thank you.
I've actually had some experience with this. You could also turn this question around. Can you afford to accept a position where they cannot afford to provide you the benefits you need? But it is common that if a church can't provide the full benefit, a portion of the cost of health insurance can be withheld from the paycheck as your contribution to that expense. So that's something that needs to be negotiated between employer and employee, and the affordability is on both sides. If that's an expense the church or school cannot afford, there's also your own ability to afford to contribute to that need.
Thank you, Eric. I think I know the answer to this, but I'll pose the question anyway. From Harold Fortune, any way to get the old salary guidelines just to provide a reference for those of us newer to working at religious institutions? James?
No.
I had a feeling you were going to say that. Leslie, did you want to say something?
Oh,
A comment about health insurance. I believe that in some states, California being one, that there is state law that either requires or permits a church, not a business of any kind, not just churches, not to offer it depending on the number of hours your position is considered to be. And so there may be state law impacting that as well. And Elizabeth, there's a question that I don't have an answer to that I think we scrolled by. Why substitute organists as opposed to supply organists? It seems that supply organist implies a level of professionalism that is often not recognized in the word substitute, a professionalism that is frequently delivered. So Vince, that's probably for you.
I actually work as a substitute organist for all of my work as an organist, and I don't really encounter the same distinction among those terms. But I think what we wanted to make sure we did in this handbook was to include everybody at all levels. So it's probably more important to lift those up from what might be seen as a lesser term than to demote those with a higher term or whatever one might think. I think this may differ in different areas of the country. Supply can also be used for pastors. There's stated supply in some churches, which is a more long-term than 1 week at a time. And maybe that's also possible for organists to supply as an interim for a period of weeks or for only 1 day. But the word substitute really should not be derogatory.
Thank you, Eric. Comment, in New York, where I live, employment is mostly at will. How is having a written agreement beneficial to a church musician, given an occurrence of a breach of contract is often hard to enforce? Vincent, you want to comment on that?
I think the important distinction here is that the written agreement clarifies some things rather than leaving them either at the negotiating table, at the interview, but it actually specifies and enumerates our legal counsel actually said that these don't have to be incredibly complicated. They can just deal with those issues that we talked about as a part of components of equitable compensation. If you go through that list and make sure that that list is addressed in your letter, you will have specific agreements between you and the employer. Again, most church musicians are employed at will. Either party can leave the contract kind of at any point. And when you put on top of that the ministerial exception, this can be very complicated to navigate. But I think one protection you can have is by having that in writing that both parties have agreed to, whether that's how much money you're allotted for continuing education or how much paid leave you're entitled to with regard to vacation or continuing ed. It's important to have those things enumerated.
James.
Well, I just want to climb on top of what Vince just said as absolutely right, and just reaffirm that. I'm going to stand on Vince's shoulders here and say that we are right now working on the document that sets forth all of the different considerations that could go into an agreement, a letter of agreement between the organist and the religious institution that's employing the organist. And it only makes common sense to put down and document the entire nature of the relationship, because at least you have something to point to. If you have nothing, then you're really just hanging by a thread all the time. But at least if you have something in writing, you can point to the document and say, you know what, it says right here, you have to give me so much severance, or you have to, give me so many days of vacation, or I'm, some extra fees for extra service work that I have to do around Christmas and Easter and so on. And it's all in writing. Every bit of it's in writing. So, it's helpful to document all aspects of the relationship whenever you can, even if you're an at-will employee.
Thank you. I am looking, just a comment, not a question. If a newer member is curious about the old salary guidelines, I think they were published in a TAO from time to time. They probably were, weren't they, James?
Yes, they were. And if you dig back into old TAOs, you'll find them. You can't unpublish something that's been published. For that matter, there's the Wayback Machine. Some of you familiar with the internet know that you can go to the Wayback Machine and find old versions of the AGO's website that has the salary guidelines on them. So notwithstanding the fact that they're out there, in the universe, we disavow them. And we are not going to promote them, and we're not going to make it easy in any means for anybody to get them. And we're not going to send you a copy because we're not supposed to do that. That's what the FTC agreement said. And we agreed to the terms of the settlement agreement. And respectfully, I'm sorry. It's kind of like Alex Trebek. No, I'm sorry. That's not the right answer. So no, I'm sorry. We can't send you the salary guidelines, even the old ones.
Thank you, James. Mary Stevens asked, what is meant by ministerial exception? Maybe you can clarify a little bit more on that, Vincent?
Yes, so as we mentioned, it's a legal doctrine which is supported by at least 2 Supreme Court decisions in which religious institutions are just given very sweeping discretion in how they want to manage their employees in terms of hiring practices, in terms of requirements of employees. And so things like when we were going through the application procedures, we wanted to put certain things in terms of anti-discrimination. And at the end of the day, it's not going to hold up because the church has the right to be able to request certain things. They have the right to be able to say, you must be of this denomination, you must possess these certain Christian characteristics, you must, they can name it. And the law permits that. If anyone else, James, and anyone else wanted to add to that, but it's a very broad sweeping exception that they have.
Thank you. Oh, James, go ahead. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
In my wonderful conversation with Ted Walter earlier today, Ted was describing a situation where a woman became pregnant. And normally, you can't fire someone because they're pregnant, but apparently this church was able to let this woman go for whatever reason because of the ministerial exception. They were not bound by FSLA or other rules or laws, about discrimination. So it really gives this ministerial exception says that if you're a minister, like a music minister at a church or a pastor, that the relationship is unique because you're in a church setting, in a religious institution, and kind of all bets are off in terms of the normal considerations for discrimination or anti-discrimination. All bets are off. Churches can do what they want because they're allowed to exercise this exception for ministers who are employed by the church.
Thank you. Christine Hogan, you mentioned having a written agreement if you do not have a contract. Do you have any suggestions how to protect musicians since specific employers, ministers, priests, et cetera, leave their posts where the musician stays? How can the musician be protected so the agreement passes through one person to another when it is not in a contract from the institution? That's an interesting question.
How can the agreement pass from one organist to another? I don't think so. I can't envision
No,
that could
I
happen.
think she was referring to when a pastor changes. And again, you could have some language in the agreement, and you could approach the outgoing pastor to create some kind of conversation between the incoming pastor to preserve that. But essentially, the incoming pastor would have, again, that same kind of discretion. And in an age where some pastors do have musicians follow them and vice versa, they kind of come in pairs at times, this can be a real threat. So I think I would approach the issue head on with the outgoing pastor to see if he could help smooth over that transition.
Excellent, thank you. John Massenberg asks, would you speak to the resident organist having the first right of refusal for funerals and weddings, etc.? However, the fee would be paid to the resident organist if another organist is preferred? James, you wrote about that in an article, didn't you? Yes.
I did. So here's the deal. The church can set, the religious institution can set whatever policies it wants. We can't impose policies like that at the AGO level. That is verboten by the FTC. But the church can have whatever kind of policies relative to who can perform on behalf of somebody else, have a guest organist, and who gets to pay whom. All of these things can be written out in church documents. The church is allowed to do whatever it wants. So the church wedding guide policy, you can have some input into that as an organist, and hopefully say, it would be nice if you have a good relationship, which is why we want a good relationship, by the way, not an adversarial relationship. If you have a good relationship with the pastor and those who are writing policy documents for the church, work this out and say, please establish a policy guide or wedding booklet. I think a lot of churches have these things in which you stipulate that if you are the incumbent organist and a guest organist is asked to play, that you are entitled to your regular salary, and that the wedding party has to pay it. That's okay if the church says it. The guild can't say it, though.
Thank you. Eric?
I just wanted to add to that we can also, as individuals, have a personal policy about how we view this. If we're asked to play somewhere and we want to say that, well, I say I don't play weddings, so that takes care of it for me. But I could also say, well, I'd like to know if you're going to reimburse the person who you've said would have these weddings as a part of their, compensation. And if you don't pay them the same thing, that I won't play. But that's an individual choice. That's not a requirement by any other institution or the AGO. And so we're also free to make that policy personally if we want to, just like the church can make its own policies individually about how they handle that arrangement.
Thank you. William Deegan posted a link. The Seattle Education Association / quote unquote union publishes their salary schedule. Someone might want to take a look at it as a reference. So it's in the chat box, which you will all be able to access. In church work in 2021, are there any protections for someone who is gay? I have had a colleague dismissed for that very reason. It is heartbreaking and frustrating, but does the church stand above the laws of discrimination?
I think that one is right for Vince and his ministerial exception, frankly.
Yeah, this is probably the most heartbreaking side of this. At the end of the day, there is going to be the right for the church to kind of make decisions in that regard, and so there's very few protections, if any, that we can point to. However, I want to just point that there is a changing wave in many denominations where particularly hierarchical leadership, bishops, and heads of synods are coming out and supporting LGBT professionals and LGBT employees. And I think it's very important that that support is vocal and that it's public, and that we help to spread the word, because I think that's a change that's going to be more cultural than it is policy. And so if we can help inspire that in churches, it will bring about some protections for LGBT employees. But if we're looking at the spirit of the law and we're looking at the letter of the law, and if you want to bring this in front of a judge, the answer to the question is sadly no.
Thank you. Louise Olson asks, regarding streaming, should it be the church's responsibility to cover the copyright issues? Leslie?
Got to unmute, Leslie.
Unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Louise, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, so I'll try and answer broadly. Obviously, I think we all want to make sure that our fellow musicians, whether composers or other instrumentalists, are taken care of well. And thus, if we're using something and it's being live streamed, we want to make sure that the church has the necessary coverage for that. Standard places to achieve that are from CCLI and onelicense.net. And in my church, I can only speak to that. It's me that has wound up doing it because I'm the one who is the most knowledgeable about how it would work. I think there are churches that do not have the expertise in anyone else on staff, but it certainly should be a budgeted item. And I think it's often the musician who has to bring that to the church's attention, that this is something that's necessary to do. And I would hope that the work involved in doing that would be part of what you would discuss when you'd had your next annual review, because it's not an insignificant amount of work to make sure that all of that is taken care of.
Thank you. So, James, unmute, please.
Sorry, I wanted to go to a different topic, unless there was more on that topic.
That's fine. We will go ahead then.
Okay. Let me just go, if I may, then, Elizabeth.
Yep.
Eileen Gunther has put in the chat, for what it's worth, the guidelines, back to the salary guidelines, were based initially on average salaries of public school teachers around the country, and then updated by the cost of living. So absolutely right. They were never based on salaries of organists, never once. And any number of people called into question, certainly the FTC, even, historically, when I say historically, when we were having these discussions with them, they called into question the legitimacy of the salary guidelines because they were based on public school teachers. Now, I remember the discussions about the merits of doing that. And that's not to say that that was a bad idea. Public school teachers stand up in front of people, they're professionals, they need to know what they're doing. And it seemed at the time like a very reasonable thing to do, to develop a salary scale that was based on professionals who had sort of a performance component, in that they were in front of people doing something that required knowledge and intelligence and experience to be able to do it. The FTC came back to us ultimately and said, someday we're going to allow you to publish salaries, but only historical, actual, real data of what real people actually earn, what real organists were actually paid, not some aspirational figure that you come up with based on public school teachers or any other teachers. It has to be real data of actual organists, like what they made, and it's got to be a couple of years old. They didn't even want it to be contemporaneous data. Don't publish something that you just that is based on current, I never quite understood this. Don't publish something the FTC said is based on current salaries. It's got to be a couple of years ago. I'm not sure how we would even develop that data, but it had to be based on actual salaries of actual organists. There was one other item. I saw something go by. I'm not sure we heard it. We had a chance to discuss it, and that was a question much earlier in all this. Someone asked a question about insofar as so many guild members are part-time organists, can we please address the part-time organist situation? I guess it was about salary. And I think the chart that we have that asks you to put down how many hours you're going to be working at every different aspect of the job is exactly the thing that can be used for part-time organists. Because you may be part-time, but you're still doing this, you're doing that, and you're performing and you're studying, and maybe you're getting robes together for the choir and keeping the organ music library up and attending meetings that you need to be at. So you're putting in a lot of hours, even if you're part-time. And all of these different tasks are delineated very thoughtfully and carefully in the new handbook. So you can actually go through it with the people who are involved in your compensation and say, look, I'm spending this many hours and this many hours and this many hours, and it's all delineated very nicely for you. It's laid out very nicely in the handbook. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Comment. So when we post open positions to our members using the listing information given to us, then we are no longer equal opportunity. Equal opportunity in the sense that everyone in the chapter gets the info, but the info can be restrictive as to who is eligible. Does anybody want to comment on that?
I don't understand the question.
I think that's a slight confusion of responsibilities. It's not the AGO chapter's responsibility to manage an employment board in the sense that they're the ones being held responsible for the rules. You know, they can pass on a job position, but I think that's a false equation. That we're not, the AGO is not providing the job; it's forwarding on information. So I don't. Or kind of a false equivalency, I think, is.
Thank you. Thank you. Donna Elkin, who's Dean of the Williamsport chapter, who just celebrated their 75th anniversary. Congratulations. James mentioned a paper that is still being developed. When will that be available? That's her first question. And the second one is, when were the ministerial exception cases heard by the courts?
Well, since I'm the one who's writing that paper, it'll be finished when I finally hunker down and finish it. It's been a work in process for some time, but I've gotten a start on it. So I'm, in front of 175 participants, I'm going to say I'll have it done within, say, the month of February. Before February is out, I will commit to getting that thing finished, but that's the first draft. And then we have to go through it. It has to be run by legal counsel. But I will commit to getting it done this month.
Thank you. And when were the ministerial exemption cases heard by the courts? Does anybody have any information on that? Vincent?
I posted that in the chat.
Okay. Eric, did you want to comment?
Well, I first heard about this. One of the cases that went to the Supreme Court, I heard about in 2006 at our National Convention in Chicago, because it had just come up as a local district case. And it has taken this long to reach the Supreme Court. So that was reached in the last year. That's 14 years in the making. So, these things started a long time ago.
Here is an interesting comment. When the AGO's salary guidelines no longer were published, our church simply surveyed churches of similar size and job responsibilities in our region to serve as a guideline for salary and package. We found that churches were happy to have the conversation for their understanding as well. These conversations have been that's and enlightening. And
that's good.
It is good. That's very positive.
Churches are allowed to talk with one another and discuss salary and compensation packages. Sure.
How would you handle a situation when the church insists on setting a cap for an organist's fees for weddings and funerals? While I do not want to nickel and dime the client, I also want to be fairly compensated for the time and efforts I spend. So to prevent an all-you-can-eat arrangement. Any comments?
I would love to defer to someone who plays weddings and funerals.
I think that you're going to have the most persuasive argument if you can reference some local rates, right? So if you are able to know that the organist down the street at the Presbyterian Church makes $250 per wedding, and you've been capped at $175, I think that's going to be a very compelling argument to take to your pastor and say, well, the going rate actually around town is a bit higher than that. I do want to bring up one thing too that Christine Hogan put in the chat, where she said public school teachers get pensions too, which is 80% of average of previous 3 years salaries for the rest of their lives. And she doesn't know any organists who get that, part or full time. And this very example is what appears in the handbook, that when you're comparing salaries, when you're comparing compensation really, and you look at those things beyond the salary, those are important components. Just in my own personal life, I've had a job that was off by about $12,000 in salary. 2 jobs were off by that, but the benefit package was so rich in the lower paying job that it actually was a much better compensation plan. And so some churches, I'm not saying all churches do this, but if you have a church with a very rich benefit package, you have to consider how that factors in.
James?
I'm not sure if we addressed this item in the chat. Should organists be paid based on competence or qualifications? And I'm going to say the answer is yes. Competence, qualifications, certification, experience, years of experience, it all is factored in. I mean, it's not one or the other, quite literally. You have to factor all aspects of the relationship. I mean, does this organist, if it's for a particular denomination, does the organist have decades and decades of experience in that denomination service, or maybe never has played at all for that denomination? And, you know, is this person an award-winning organist out of an AGO competition or not? And is the person, you know, just out of school or not? I mean, all of these things have to be factored in determining the compensation. It's a very good question, and it's a very fair, I think, way to assess the compensation package by considering everything.
Cindy Linding Martin had a very interesting comment. There is an app called Toggle that a person may use in recording your hours throughout the week. Especially for part-time employees, this might be a good tool to see what you are doing and how much time you spend on tasks. This may be a good resource to use as information for future discussions for your employer. It's a great idea. Was there not a survey that was conducted some years ago with the results being published in the monthly magazine based on church membership size? I don't know.
Survey of compensation based on, you think that's what that question's about?
I would
Based
assume,
on church membership size?
yeah.
I mean, we generally know that urban churches and large churches and churches with beautiful big organs and churches with many choral programs and churches with handbell choirs will pay more than rural churches in small communities. You know, I mean, it's just because they have greater assets, they can afford to pay more.
Ron Kenrick asks, is it okay to talk about fees at a meeting?
Please don't.
Do you want to elaborate on that? I mean,
Yes, I will elaborate on it.
I would assume he's talking about when he's having, maybe I'm wrong. Ron, are you talking about at a meeting when you're having an interview or for a position, or are you talking about at a chapter meeting?
I thought it was a chapter meeting. I understood that to be an AGO meeting.
Okay. I was thinking more of an interview, and you certainly would probably, depending on how the conversation was going at some point, you'd have a right to ask what the compensation is going to be.
I heard that differently. So my brother, who's an attorney, he and I have had many conversations about AGO matters and salary matters. And he said, for example, if a couple of people who deliver milk are together at a meeting, they can't decide that one person will be the only person who delivers milk on the south side of Main Street, and the other person will be the only person who delivers milk on the north side of the street, and then they can decide among them what they're going to get paid. because they've eliminated the competition and they have a monopoly on delivering milk and they can get paid whatever they demand. So similarly, roughly similarly, it's not good to have any conversation at an AGO meeting about salaries, because then there could be the accusation, wrongful though it might be, that there's salary setting going on. And the last thing we want, the last thing we want is any allegation that AGO members are sitting in a chapter meeting setting salaries and saying, I'm not going to play for a church, excuse me, for anything less than X. And someone says, yeah, I won't do that either. And we're going to set salaries. No, please don't do that.
Thank you. Eric, I know you wanted to comment.
I just wanted to say that that's one of the reasons for this handbook, because people need to discuss the ways in which you determine what your fee is, not a number. And everybody wants a simple list, like we used to have schedules of substitute fees and wedding fees and funeral fees, where you could just point to a number. But unfortunately, we have to do the hard work of determining what the job is and charging according to that, according to your skills, your experience, your qualifications, your education. And it's not easy, and it's really difficult because you're comparing yourself to colleagues, or others are being encouraged to compare you and your skills to someone else. But that's what we're paid on. That is where we find that number, not a chart. And it's really important that we educate the entire membership through this handbook about how you determine your fees, not sharing what the numbers are.
James.
Well, it just goes back to the title of our session, Know Your Value. Just exactly what Eric said. You need to know your value.
Thank you. And Leslie, unmute, please.
Skipped over a question earlier that's where she said, how would you suggest we deal with a situation where the organist is now also the virtual choir director, and where in addition to the usual in-person services, the organist is expected to record and perform for additional online streamed services? A place where I think many of us find ourselves.
That's job creep, where the job keeps expanding and expanding and expanding in light of different circumstances. And I think that the right thing to do is have a discussion with your supervisor and say, I'm doing a lot more stuff than I ever had to do before. And I think compensation needs to keep up with the added responsibility and time required and the skill set required to do these things.
I'd like to just add that on our COVID-19 resources page, that question has also come up. And just like James was mentioning, a discussion needs to be had. But our legal counsel did say you need to talk about these things, more time, more work outside of the scope of your job. Yes, you do need to be compensated for that. And that's a negotiation. So I would direct everyone to if that COVID-19 resources page, we'll find a link for you to put into the chat, but I would check that out, because there are many questions and answers that were brought up to our legal counsel.
Thank you, Vincent. We are at the 6 o'clock hour now of our webinar. Does anybody want to close with some final thoughts before we end this?
Important final thought. The book, the new handbook, is available for free on request. Now, we haven't published enough to be able to, if everybody right now, 161 participants all dialed in and said, I'd like a hard copy, we don't have enough in-house right now to meet the demand. But we have made the representation, as Eric has reminded me, that these are available from AGO headquarters at no cost, on request.
Excellent, excellent. Vince, any closing thoughts?
Can I just add
Sorry,
that I
Vicky,
think
please.
with all of the questions that, yeah, sorry. I think this brings up what I said earlier, that there are so many questions that I know are going to keep popping up as you look at all of this. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to help, because we are in this together. So I think that's important. So we're here to help.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, if there are no further comments, I'm going to thank you all. I want to thank our panelists. This was an incredibly rich discussion, and you do need to know your value. It's important. you should be valued and you need to know your value. So we'll just end it at that. And if you do have additional questions that were not answered, you can always send them to me, elizabeth.george@agohq.org. So thank you, Vince. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, James. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Leslie. And with that, we will say good night to everyone, and everybody stay safe in the north, where I hear they're over 14 inches in the New Jersey, New York area. So nobody out there shoveling, please. Thank you, and take care.